It seems like everywhere you look these days, every business article you read, the word tariff is front and center.
Yeah, it's become a major, I guess you could say, a major force, really shaping how companies operate.
Definitely a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
And honestly, for a lot of businesses, just figuring out how to deal with them, how to make the right moves,
Hmm.
it can feel a bit like, wading through a legal document.
Oh, absolutely.
Endless and full of jargon.
So that's what we're diving into today, right here. We're going to take a look at, what companies are actually doing, the real strategies they are using to handle these tariffs.
Yeah, think of this as your cheat sheet, essentially.
Yeah.
Cutting through all the noise, all the complexity, and getting straight to the core insights that you can actually put to use.
Exactly. Actionable insights, no fluff. So, with all of these global trade tensions, businesses have to be proactive, right? They can't just sit back and wait. What have you seen in terms of, how companies are responding and adapting? Well, from the range of information we've been looking at, it's clear that companies are definitely not standing still. There's a real spectrum of approaches out there. I mean, some are making some pretty fundamental changes to their supply chains,
Hmm.
while others are getting, well, pretty sophisticated with their financial tools.
Interesting.
Our goal today is to kind of distill all of that down, to break it down into those key strategies, those real-world tactics that will give you a solid understanding of how companies are not just surviving, but actually thriving in this environment.
That's perfect. And the first big idea that seems to be popping up everywhere is this whole thing about diversifying supply chains.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds logical, I guess, on the surface. Like, don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially if that basket might get hit with tariffs.
Exactly. It's about spreading the risk.
But what does that actually look like in the real world, in practice?
Well, at its core, it's about identifying and really cultivating those relationships with suppliers in countries that, aren't subject to the same tariff rules.
So finding alternatives, basically.
Right. And one of the examples that really stood out to me from our research was this U.S. electronics manufacturer.
Okay.
They were getting hit hard with tariffs on components coming from China.
Makes sense.
And so what they're doing now is they're actively looking for and establishing relationships with suppliers in Vietnam instead.
Interesting. So shifting their sourcing, basically.
Exactly. And what this forces businesses to do is really bake resilience, build resilience right into their operations.
Yeah, because if you're too reliant on one source and something happens, your whole operation could grind to a halt.
Precisely. And this also might mean moving away from that just-in-time inventory model
Oh, right.
and potentially shifting to a more just-in-case model, which has huge implications for managing your working capital and thinking about risk in a different way.
And I imagine it's not as simple as just like swapping out one supplier for another, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It's not just about finding a lower price tag because a supplier isn't facing the same tariffs. You have to get into the nitty-gritty, Really think about quality control. Can these new suppliers consistently meet your standards?
Yeah, that's a huge one.
What about lead times? Can they deliver on time, reliably, when you need those materials? And then, of course, there's the whole geopolitical landscape. Are you just trading one set of risks for another by moving into a new region?
Right, so maybe there are political instabilities or, other potential issues you need to be aware of.
Exactly. So the key, I think, the real takeaway here is that it's about building strong, reliable relationships with multiple suppliers.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you have options, you have backup plans. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Exactly. Don't become overly dependent on any single source.
Now, I did see some mentions of some practical resources, things that could help with this whole supplier diversification process.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Things like supplier databases like Thomas Marn, these platforms can be really helpful,
Okay.
For identifying, vetting, actually connecting with potential new suppliers.
And finding ones that fit your specific needs in your industry.
Precisely. You can filter by location, by what they produce, all sorts of criteria.
That's great. So those are definitely tools worth exploring. Now, another strategy that seems to be gaining a lot of attention is leveraging free trade agreements, or I guess for short, FTAs.
Right.
Now, FTAs, I got to be honest, they can sound kind of technical and maybe a little bit dry.
Oh, yeah.
So for our listeners who are trying to grasp this quickly, what's the bottom line? Why should they care about FTAs?
Well, think of FTAs as like preferential trade deals, They're agreements between countries that basically offer reduced tariffs, sometimes even zero tariffs, on certain goods traded between those countries.
So it's like a special club with its own set of rules.
Yeah, and the strategic advantage here isn't just about the lower tariffs themselves. It's about the opportunity it creates for companies in those countries to set up regional manufacturing hubs to work together more closely.
So fostering closer economic ties, more stability.
Exactly. But the key is understanding how to actually qualify for these preferential rates, how to make them work for you.
Okay, so it's not just about saying, hey, we're part of this FTA, so no tariffs for us.
Yeah.
There's got to be more to it.
Oh, for sure. And one of our sources actually had a great example, a Canadian automaker that, thanks to the USMCA, which is the updated NAFTA,
Right.
they can often avoid those Section 232 tariffs on steel when they export vehicles to the U.S.
Oh, okay, so it's a way to potentially sidestep some of these tariff hikes.
Yeah.
But what are the practical steps? I mean, what do they need to do to make this work for them?
Well, this gets into something really important, the rules of origin.
Hmm.
To get those FTA benefits, your products, they usually have to meet certain criteria. They have to prove they were made in the right places.
So it's not just about where the final product is assembled, it's about where the components come from, the whole process.
Exactly. Like there might be rules about what's called regional value content, which means a certain percentage of the product's value has to be added within those FTA member countries. And then, of course, there's the paperwork. You'll usually need some kind of official certification, like a certificate of origin, to show that your goods actually meet those requirements.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not an automatic free pass. There's definitely some homework involved, some due diligence to make sure you qualify. Now, the next strategy we're going to talk about sounds a bit like playing a game with the rules.
Yeah.
It's about optimizing product classification. Can you break that down for us?
Well, the interesting thing here is that the exact tariff you pay can actually depend on how your product is classified. And this is where the harmonized system or the HS codes come in.
HS codes.
Yeah, they're basically these standardized codes used by customs officials around the world to categorize goods.
So everything has its own code, its own specific classification.
Right. And the strategy here is to really scrutinize those codes, to figure out if your product could legitimately be classified under a different code, maybe a more specific code that has a lower tariff rate.
Oh, I see. So it's about finding the most advantageous classification within the rules.
Exactly. And it's not always obvious. There are thousands of these subcategories within the HS system. It's kind of an art and a science.
Well, you have to know the system inside and out.
Oh, yeah. If you get it wrong, it can lead to some big penalties. But if you get it right, it can be a real advantage.
I imagine it's kind of like those cases where they argue whether a tomato is a fruit or a vegetable.
Yeah.
Technically it's a fruit, but for tariff purposes, it might be classified as a vegetable.
Exactly. It's all about the details, the technical specs, the intended use. It can get really nuanced.
So give us a real-world example of how this plays out.
Okay, so imagine you're importing, let's say, wooden chairs. Now, wooden chairs might have a certain HS code with a specific tariff rate. But what if those same chairs are imported unassembled as assembled kits? They might fall under a totally different code with a lower tariff. It's about how the product is presented, its condition at the moment it's imported.
Okay, so it's not about misrepresenting what the product is, but about classifying it accurately and strategically to, to minimize the tariff burden.
Precisely. You're not changing the product itself, just how it's categorized.
It sounds like you need some serious expertise to pull this off effectively.
Well, absolutely. Our sources strongly recommend working with customs brokers or tariff engineering experts.
Okay, so people who really specialize in this.
Yeah, they live and breathe HS codes. They know all the latest rulings and interpretations. They can make sure you're taking advantage of every legitimate opportunity.
Got it. So it's definitely worth exploring, but you want to make sure you have the right guidance. Now, let's shift gears and talk about a strategy that involves a bigger commitment, a bigger change, investing in domestic production.
Right. This is a major strategic decision.
Yeah, it's not just about tweaking things around the edges.
No, it involves actually relocating your manufacturing either to a country that isn't subject to those specific tariffs you're facing,
Okay.
or, bringing it back home, which we often hear called onshoring or reshoring.
So basically, eliminate those import tariffs by not importing.
Exactly.
And we actually have a pretty well-known example of this in action, don't we?
Yeah, Tesla with their gigafactories.
Right.
They've invested heavily in these factories in the U.S. and Germany.
So they're producing more domestically.
Yeah, and that significantly reduces their reliance on imported vehicles and components, things that might otherwise be hit with tariffs, like those coming from China.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But Tesla's a giant company with, huge resources. For smaller businesses, this might not be realistic, right? What are some more, I guess, incremental steps they could take before considering something this drastic?
Yeah, that's a great point. A full-on factory move might not be feasible for everyone, but the principle here, the idea of reducing dependence on imports, that can be applied in phases. Maybe a company could start sourcing more raw materials domestically, or maybe some semi-finished goods, even if the final assembly happens elsewhere.
Okay, so kind of shifting the balance of the production process.
Exactly. They could also look into contract manufacturing, partnering with someone in a tariff-free zone before going all in on building their own facilities.
So kind of testing the waters, getting their feet wet before diving in headfirst.
Exactly. It's about being strategic, thinking long-term.
Now, another interesting concept that came up in our research was the use of foreign trade zones, or FTZs.
Oh, yeah.
This sounds a bit like a special tool in the world of international trade.
It is.
How do these actually work to help companies mitigate tariffs?
So an FTZ, imagine it like a designated area within a country that, as far as customs is concerned, is actually outside the country.
Oh, okay, like a little island within a country.
Yeah, in a way. And this gives you some big advantages when it comes to tariffs. Like you can defer paying those tariffs. You don't actually pay them until the goods leave the FTZ and enter the domestic market.
So it's a way to manage cash flow, basically.
It is, but it's even more strategic than that. You can actually avoid tariffs completely on goods that are brought into the FTZ and then re-exported.
Oh, wow, so they never even touch the domestic market.
Exactly. And there's a great example of this with the BMW plant in South Carolina.
Okay.
They import parts duty-free into the FTZ, assemble the cars there, and then export a lot of those cars without ever paying U.S. tariffs on those imported parts.
That's really smart. So they're basically operating in this tariff-free bubble within the U.S. It makes you wonder why more companies aren't doing this.
Well, it really depends on their business model, their volume of imports and exports, their whole supply chain setup.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. Setting up in an FTZ, it comes with its own regulations and requirements.
So it might not be practical for every company.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about strategies that involve working with your existing suppliers. Renegotiating those contracts seems like a pretty logical step when you're facing new tariffs.
It is. If you can't or you don't want to overhaul your entire supply chain, trying to share that burden with your current suppliers just makes sense.
So what are some of the ways companies are doing that?
Well, our sources mention a couple of key tactics. One is simply going to your suppliers and asking for price reductions to help offset those added costs from the tariffs.
Just straight up asking for a better deal.
Right. And the other is exploring cost-sharing agreements where both you and your supplier agree to absorb a portion of those tariff expenses.
So kind of spreading the pain, working together.
Yeah, exactly.
And there was also something about Incoterms. How do those play into this?
Oh, right. Incoterms are basically this set of standardized trade terms that define who's responsible for what when it comes to shipping goods internationally,
Okay.
including who pays the tariffs. So by strategically choosing a certain Incoterm, like DDP, which stands for Delivered Duty Paid,
Okay. You can actually shift that responsibility for paying the tariffs onto your supplier. Now, of course, they'll likely factor that into their price.
right, it's not like it just disappears.
But it can make your life a lot easier. Your customs process becomes simpler, and you know what your costs are up front.
So it's about clarity and predictability.
Exactly. And beyond just DDP, understanding other Incoterms is important too. They cover things like insurance, who's responsible for loading and unloading the goods.
Oh, I see. So there are a lot of potential hidden costs beyond just the tariff itself.
Exactly. You got to look at the whole picture.
Now, let's talk about the option that consumers probably feel the most directly, passing on those increased costs to them. How do companies typically approach that?
Well, the most common way is to gradually increase prices,
Yeah.
to reflect those added tariff costs.
So it's not like a sudden, huge price jump, more like small, incremental increases.
Right. But our sources make a really good point. How well this works depends a lot on the product. Like, how essential is it?
Think about basic food staples or medicine. People need those things, so they might be willing to pay a bit more.
Even if the price goes up.
But if it's something they can live without, a luxury item or something,
People might start looking for alternatives.
exactly, they might become more price sensitive. And our sources also stress the importance of being transparent with your customer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you're raising prices, explain why. Tell them it's because of the tariffs. Be upfront.
So they understand it's not just arbitrary.
Right. It can help maintain trust and loyalty.
Now, another tactic that came up that seems like it could buy some time but also has its own risks is stockpiling inventory. What's
Yeah.
the thinking there?
Basically, it's about trying to get ahead of those new tariffs. Like if you know tariffs are coming, you accelerate your imports, bring in a lot of inventory before those tariffs hit.
So you're basically locking in the lower price.
Exactly. And it lets you keep your prices stable for a while, at least until you run through that stockpile.
But I imagine there are some downsides to this.
Oh, for sure. There are some big risks.
Like what?
Well, first off, you got to store all that extra inventory. That means warehouse costs, insurance, security, all that. It adds up.
Yeah, that can get expensive.
And then there's the risk that the stuff you stockpiled becomes obsolete. Maybe newer models come out, or maybe the product has a shelf life and it expires.
Right, so you could end up with a warehouse full of stuff you can't sell.
Exactly. And then there's the financial strain. You're tying up a lot of cash in that inventory.
Okay, so it's a gamble.
Hmm.
You got to weigh those risks and benefits carefully. Now, let's talk about a more, a more proactive strategy, one that involves trying to change the rules themselves, lobbying for exemptions. How does a company or even an entire industry go about doing that?
Well, it usually involves working with trade groups and industry associations to make their case directly to the government.
So strength in numbers, basically.
Exactly. By joining forces, they can amplify their voice, put more pressure on policymakers.
And do we have any examples of this actually working?
We do. The U.S. solar industry is a good one.
Okay.
They lobbied really hard and were able to secure exemptions for imported bifacial solar panels just last year.
It can be done.
It can. It shows that organized effort can actually make a difference. And our sources highlighted some key channels for this kind of advocacy, like the NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
So those are organizations worth connecting with if you're in that situation.
Definitely. Now, shifting our focus a little bit, let's look inward. What can companies do internally to navigate these tariff challenges?
Well, there's this whole concept of enhancing operational efficiency.
Right.
Basically, the idea is that if you streamline your processes, make things run more smoothly, you can reduce your overall costs.
Exactly. And those savings can help offset those added costs from the tariffs.
So it's about finding ways to be leaner and more efficient.
Precisely. And there are lots of ways to do that. You can look at automation, maybe reduce labor costs that way. You can optimize your logistics, figure out the most efficient shipping routes, take advantage of bulk discounts.
So it's about squeezing efficiencies out of every part of your operation.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
Now, we also saw a mention of something called tariff engineering. That sounds pretty specialized.
It is. It's about actually modifying your products specifically to qualify for a lower tariff classification.
So you're basically tweaking the product itself to fit into a better category.
Exactly. Like one of our sources gave the example of slightly changing the blend of fabrics in a garment to meet the rules of a specific free trade agreement.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it gets really granular.
So you really need to understand the intricacies of those tariff codes and how even small product changes can impact your classification.
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely a specialized area.
And finally, our sources talked about the importance of managing those financial risks that come with tariffs, using hedging strategies.
Right.
Can you explain that in a way that that makes sense for someone who's not a financial expert?
Sure. Hedging is basically about using financial tools to protect yourself from potential losses.
Okay.
And those losses could come from things like fluctuating exchange rates, which are often affected by tariffs and trade tensions.
Right.
Or they could come from the risk of your customers not paying their bills, maybe because of trade disruptions.
Okay, so hedging is about minimizing those financial uncertainties.
Exactly. And there are different tools you can use, like currency forwards. Those can help stabilize the cost of your imports by locking in a favorable exchange rate for future transactions.
So you're basically setting a fixed price in advance.
Exactly.
Right.
And then there's trade credit insurance, which protects you if a customer doesn't pay you.
So it's like a safety net.
Exactly.
So as we kind of zoom out and look at this big picture, it's clear that there's no single answer, no magic bullet when it comes to dealing with tariffs.
That's absolutely right. It's a complex landscape, and you need a multifaceted approach. You have to be proactive. You have to be adaptable.
And as we've seen today, there are a lot of different strategies out there. Everything from rethinking your whole supply chain to navigating those complex regulations, to finding creative ways to manage costs, to actually pushing for changes in the rules themselves.
Exactly. It's a dynamic situation, and businesses have to be creative. Think outside the box, explore all their options.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. We've covered a lot of ground today, but hopefully it's given our listeners a good overview of the landscape, the different tools and tactics they can use to navigate this challenging environment.
I hope so. It's about being informed, being flexible, and constantly adapting to those changes in the global trade environment.
Absolutely. So as you're listening to all of this, think about the big picture. All these shifts happening in supply chains, in regulations, in costs. What do you think the long-term impact will be? How will businesses need to adapt to thrive in this world of ongoing and maybe even increasing trade complexity?
It's a fascinating question.
It is. It's a question that doesn't have a simple answer,
Not at all.
but it's a question worth pondering because those strategic decisions that businesses make today, those are going to have ripple effects throughout entire industries and sectors.
Absolutely. They will shape the future of the global economy.
So it's important to understand the forces at play, the different approaches companies are taking, and the potential consequences.
Exactly. It's all about being informed and prepared.
Well said. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. It's been a really insightful conversation.
My pleasure.
Until next time.
If you found this discussion informative, please like, subscribe, and share this channel to get daily discussions on a current economic topic.